drama series Vikings tells the story of one man's meteoric rise from simple farmer to Viking king. Inspired by both legend and history, the show portrays the brutality and the humanity of the Vikings. But where does myth end and fact begin? This series is a journey of discovery across 8 countries with the world's top Viking experts and members of the Vikings cast to reveal who the Vikings really were. In this episode, the story of the Viking invasions of Europe.
Why do the Vikings start to do what they do?
The secret of the Viking longboat.
They could hit hard, and there wasn't an awful lot that people on land could do to stop them.
A country ripe for plunder. And an empire on the brink of collapse.
If you wanted an event that had sort of a similar impact, it would have to be something like 9/11.
Michael Hurst is the creator and writer of the drama Vikings.
I've always been interested in Vikings. Most little boys are interested in Vikings, I think, and I still remember the day that my father brought home a little Viking model. I started to do a little research, and I found them fascinating. Their culture, their social habits, and their pagan gods.
Vikings is based on the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok and his band of raiders in the Age of Invasion.
I've always said that the stories and the scripts begin with real events, with real people, with real things, but then I have to join them together. I have to make narrative roads as authentically and logically as possible.
Forgive me if I did not kiss your hand.
But where does fact meet fiction in the story of the Vikings? And what do we really know about the Viking invasions that transformed Europe and cemented the legend of the Norsemen? Actor Clive Standen plays the war chief Rollo, a real-life Viking who was part of the wave of invasions that touched every corner of Europe and beyond.
We imagine them as these horned helmet devil monsters who came from the sea on their longboats and raided their way through Britain. We're not trying to say that they didn't do any of these questionable things. It's more that history was recorded by the invaded, as opposed to the invaders, because the Vikings were very much illiterate. They didn't write anything down.
Neil Price has devoted his career to understanding the real Vikings through archaeology, unraveling myth from history, and drilling down on the forces that pushed them out into the world in the first place.
One of the most fundamental questions of Viking studies is, why do the Vikings start to do what they do? Why does the Viking Age, as we conceive it, begin? What is it that pushes these people out from Scandinavia? Was it the climate? Was the weather and the environmental conditions in Scandinavia worsening? Was it something to do with the internal power struggles? Were some people pushed abroad as exiles? That's certainly a factor in this, but not the only one. One of them is undoubtedly technological. The development of improved shipping techniques, shipping construction that quite simply makes these things possible.
The construction is different. It's built with a strong central plank.
And you think it could handle long sea voyages?
That's why I'm building it.
In the drama Vikings, the character of Floki is the master builder of a revolutionary new kind of ship.
I told you I could do it!
And it's a radical new approach to shipbuilding, one that the real Vikings mastered, that propelled them out of Scandinavia and ignited the age of invasion.
The classic Viking ship is a masterpiece of design. It can cross the open sea, but also go up the rivers. It has a sail that's perfectly adapted to those kinds of circumstances. It's very maneuverable. It's quick to take down. And this means that the crew can switch from sail power to oar power in a very short space of time. It's a very formidable weapon.
In the late 1950s, near Roskilde, Denmark, archaeologists discovered 5 amazingly well-preserved Viking ships in the frigid waters of a nearby fjord. Now, they're the models for a growing fleet of replica ships. Built by hand, the old way, and using the very same materials they did in the Viking Age.
Kan vi få nogle klare meldinger?
Today, 60 volunteer sailors are putting the Sea Stallion through her paces to see what can be learned about Viking seamanship. Archaeologist Ben Raffield specializes in the warrior culture of the Norsemen, and he's come to Roskilde to see for himself how the longship helped transform the Vikings into the most feared warriors of the Middle Ages.
In my own research, I'm interested in the kind of social aspects of generally of the Vikings, but especially in situations involving warfare and conflict.
Og husk, når I ikke arbejder, så må I gerne sidde ned.
It's actually the crew coming together as well as the technology just to make sure that you're getting the most out of the ship at any one time.
Yeah, both in terms of speed, but also in terms of safety. It's really important that everybody is working together.
Actually experiencing this, you really get an idea of how spending fairly long amounts of time in confined space like this, how it really brings together a group of people.
They had to rely upon each other as sailors and as fighters. I think all those things helped establish significant social unity that made them somehow even more powerful.
Sail down!
The idea of becoming a strong unit. Once you hit the beach and you want to fight with the enemy, then these things, in my opinion, becomes really vital in staying together, becoming a unit and fighting together.
In the late 790s, small bands of heavily armed raiders crashed down on the coast of England.
When the Vikings arrive in England in the sort of late 780s, early 790s, what's happening is they're coming into a world that's completely different from their own. There are these little monasteries scattered, usually in very isolated, out-of-the-way places.
So Here we are in the chancel of modern-day St. Paul's Church, which is still a working church 1,300 years after its foundation, and was actually the first building to be built here when the monks arrived.
Don't be afraid. Trust in God. And let us pray.
What would it look like in here back then?
The walls would have been whitewashed and it would have been very highly decorated. This is the very site that a very well-known Viking raid took place 1,200 years ago.
Fiat Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Pater Noster qui es in
The Viking raiders would have entered the church, perhaps to find the cowering monks terrified for their lives. It's these things that the Viking raiders would have wanted to get their hands on. Of course, they weren't Christian, so they weren't being respectful to these very sacred relics to the Anglo-Saxons, so they would have pillaged the place and took whatever they could get their hands on.
And to them, it's just a complete culture clash. It's extraordinary that they turn up somewhere where there is a huge amount of movable wealth.
The idea that these non-Christians were coming and so easily destroying and taking things that were so sacred to the Anglo-Saxons, that there would have been perhaps some fear and also disbelief that this was actually taking place.
During the Viking raids in the late 8th century, England is slowly climbing out of the Dark Ages, fragmented and vulnerable.
Effendator remissionem peccatorem.
In northern England, just outside modern-day Newcastle, Bedesworld is a reconstructed Anglo-Saxon village that transports visitors back to the medieval era.
The buildings on the farm are based on excavated sites from sites throughout Northumberland, and they've all been reconstructed using Anglo-Saxon tools, Anglo-Saxon techniques.
What's going on in Anglo-Saxon England, on the eve of the Viking Age? England didn't exist, really.
It didn't, no. Britain was broken up into a number of different kingdoms, all of which had their own rulers, and the borders were constantly changing.
So, these weren't actually often friends. There was a fair amount of conflict going on between them at times.
That's right, there's certainly no centralised force within Britain at this time.
Say no! Shame on you!
In the drama series, and in the real history of Anglo-Saxon Britain, at the beginning of the 9th century, Ecgbert is one of 7 kings vying for control of England, even before there was an England.
The character of King Egbert in the drama series is the viewer's kind of point of contact to Anglo-Saxon England, its politics, its culture, and many of the things that are depicted in his court are absolutely accurate reflections of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and how they related to each other and to their past.
Egbert was to be King of England, and he really plants the seed of this idea that there will be a country called England, and it will have a ruling family, and that ruling family will pass power down from generation to generation. That's a completely new idea.
The different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms all have their own agendas that are meshing together. Sometimes they conflict, sometimes they run in parallel.
If you and I join together, not only against the Northmen, but also against Mercia, we should surely overcome it.
Let us drink to our alliance.
Egbert enjoys power. He enjoys using power for larger and better ends. He believes, now I'm sure this is true, that if you could unite the English kingdoms under one authority, England would be better able to defend itself against Vikings.
Inside the British Library in London, historian Claire Downham has uncovered remarkable 1,200-year-old documents laying out the plans for the earliest Anglo-Saxon resistance to the Vikings.
Tell me about what we have here in front of us.
Okay, so this is one of a series of charters which come from Christ Church, Canterbury. So what we have here is a grant of land which dates to the year 811. It's also referring to the fortification of strongholds and also the building of bridges against the pagans. And this term contra paganos here is the interesting bit because they are clearly being identified as the main threat to the security of this landholding. And the kind of activities there is also indicative of a level of military organisation in the face of Viking attacks.
We tend to have this view of the early part of the Viking Age as, you know, the Vikings coming over and ransacking targets, and actually Anglo-Saxons not having much of a response, but they should be able to actually defend themselves and even mount offensives against these incoming forces.
Yeah, exactly. It's showing coordinated, organised defence.
Just as the Anglo-Saxons switched tactics, so too do the Vikings. They now set their sights on the riches of mainland Europe.
Vikings are very practical raiders. They go for least resistance. If the fighting is too hard, if the enemy is too well prepared, they just cross the channel. They go to the other side.
For the Vikings, the Frankish Empire represents a kind of cornucopia of choice. It's a tremendously rich place and a tremendously tempting target in every way.
The Vikings are about to unleash hell on Francia, the superpower of the Middle Ages.
When we think of the Viking raids and how they begun, there's no sense in which the Vikings are heading out into an unknown world. They know exactly what's out there. And really, their attention is principally south into the Frankish Empire, one of the great superpowers of the time, with its markets, its towns. So there's really an embarrassment of riches for them to choose from.
Today, the city of Aachen is in western Germany. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, it was the site of one of the greatest courts in the ascendant Frankish Empire. And no star burned more brightly than the mighty Charlemagne, who ruled the Franks from the year 800 until his death in 814.
Charlemagne creates around him Renaissance in art, in literature. He creates a really glittering court, a court that by by the standards of someone like Egbert arriving from Wessex, is just awe-inspiring. There are buildings that are made of stone. There are palaces that are 500 meters wide.
We're about to walk into the presence of Charlemagne himself.
We are. Perhaps the most famous image of Charlemagne from the Middle Ages, a piece of his skull in there. The year is 814, and finally Charlemagne is dead. We're standing here in front of his coffin, a reused Roman sarcophagus fit for an emperor. And things really start to go wrong.
After Charlemagne's death, internal rivalries soon plunge Francia into a state of civil war. In true Viking fashion, Francia's crisis becomes the Norsemen's opportunity. Once again, they prepare to raid.
One of the things that makes the Frankish Empire intensely vulnerable is water. If you look at the main centers of Frankish power, they're situated on rivers. But for the Vikings, they're nothing less than motorways. They take them quickly, directly to the heart of things.
After Charlemagne's death, the Vikings sack Aachen Cathedral.
These doors are actually the doors that have stood there since Charlemagne's time. These are 1,200-year-old doors. 1,200 years old. 1,200 years old. It's quite extraordinary to stand here in modern-day Aachen and see exactly what the Vikings would have seen. Took what they could. That was the thing about being a Viking. You took your plunder, you took your loot, you took it back home. But these things, well, they wouldn't fit in your hand luggage, would they? No. And would you sink your boat with one of these, do you think? I don't know. You certainly wouldn't fit two of them on a Viking longship. And that's probably why they're still here today, because they're far too big to take away with you. If you were a Scandinavian who came here, the idea was it will blow your socks off. You'd be so impressed.
The other jewel in the crown of Frankish cities is Paris. With the nobility fighting amongst themselves for control, it had never been more vulnerable or more attractive to the restless Viking raiders.
Tell me about Paris.
It was amazing. I've never in my whole life seen anything like it. It was like a dream. And churches, such churches.
In the third season of the drama series, this is what Ragnar starts to plug into. He hears about Paris, this fabled city. In his terms, perhaps the ultimate target. It's a draw.
I've made up my mind. And this year, we shall attack Paris.
Paris!
Haven't you told us all about this before?
Historical records from the time describe Ragnar as a leader of the siege.
So this will not...
For Ragnar to hear that there are such places, which are almost beyond imagining, of course stimulates him and interests him.
The Viking attacks on the Franks, on the Empire, provide an opportunity for material gain, for loot and wealth. But there are other things just as important to the Vikings, and that is the opportunity to increase their status, to increase their fame, perhaps almost as a kind of religious act.
There is, under the Viking psyche, this belief that your fate has been decided at your birth. All you can do is hope that the gods have a heroic death in battle planned for you, because a best Viking death is to die in battle. That way you go to Valhalla. So Paris is a good place to go if you fancy going to Valhalla.
In the year 845, the splendors of the royal court of King Charles are legendary. For Viking raiders on a constant prowl for fresh plunder, it's an irresistible urge.
Not only is Paris a very valuable target to attack, it is a famous target to attack. It speaks volumes. So if you can go there and attack them there, it does say, I have a free hand, I can do what I like wherever I like.
Sailing south by southeast, we come upon the mouth of the Seine, the gateway to Paris. Here is the entrance. The entrance to paradise.
Starting as early as 810, Viking raiders begin terrorizing the northern coast of Francia. It's the beginning of a century of invasions deep into the heart of continental Europe.
In the drama series, Ragnar's attack on Paris is very much the Vikings' first contact with the Empire. But of necessity, this is very much a compression, for dramatic reasons, of what is actually decades of escalating Viking attacks.
In Oiselle, in northern France, archaeological evidence of Viking camps have been found along the Seine River. Actor Clive Standen, who plays Rollo in the drama series, has come to Rouen to see where real Vikings lived and fought.
Nikolai, could you talk us through a little bit of what we see on the table?
So I've got here a little selection of Viking items from our collections. So first of all, this sword here has been excavated in Normandy during the 19th century from Oiselle, which was a very famous and important winter camp for the Viking on the Seine River. And if you look closer to the knob, you can see this semicircular shape, and it's a typical Viking shape for a sword.
It's amazing actually being able to have them out and to
Do you want to handle this sword? We can be cautious about that, but okay, so just put one hand here now.
Wow.
Right. Up.
Now this is something you don't get to do every day.
So it's very light.
But it is light, but it must be just because it's corroded so much as well.
Yeah.
Continuing their relentless move upriver from their camps on the Seine, the Vikings seem unstoppable. More than 1,000 years after the last Viking longships ravaged the Seine, echoes of the terror that was the Norsemen can still be felt. Archaeologist Gareth Williams is an expert on Viking battle strategies.
One of the things that's hard to imagine today is just how terrifying it would be to see an entire fleet coming up the river. That dragonhead prow comes around the corner, and then another, and then another, and then another. We hear accounts of hundreds of ships in a fleet, able to divert quickly to either bank, attack to either side, seizing the opportunity.
Lying between the Vikings and Paris is the Abbey of Saint-Denis, one of the holiest sites in all of Francia.
This is the resting place of the Frankish kings. It's also the keeping place of holy relics. The Frankish emperor is using this as his command center. This is where he's gathering his troops outside Paris in advance of the Viking attack.
When Ragnar attacks in Mercia in the series, that's based entirely on an account of the Vikings attacking on the Seine, where Charles rather foolishly puts half his army on one side of the river and half on the other.
The battle that takes place here is, at that time, the greatest confrontation that has been between the Franks and the Vikings. By this stage, we're told 120 ships sailing up the Seine. That could easily be a force of 5,000 men, and similar numbers, if not greater, on the Frankish side. So it's a real battle.
Concentrate the full attack on the right bank. Hard steel board!
There was two armies on opposite banks of the river, and we have Ragnar just deciding that, well, obviously I'll go and attack this small army, and not only do I stand a better chance of beating them, but the army on the other side will see me do it. The Franks expected that when there was a battle, you lined up and you fought each other. That was the sort of decent thing to do. The Vikings didn't do that. They capture 111 people, and they hang them on an island in the middle of the Seine in front of the other army. The other army, at this point, not surprisingly, runs away. They come across with the heads hanging from their ships. And fear is just as good a weapon as a sword, and Vikings were very happy to use that whenever they could. If you wanted an event that had sort of a similar impact to the Vikings attacking Paris in the modern world, it would have to be something like 9/11, where you have a group of people who are prepared to do something that is simply unthinkable, that don't play by your rules.
Both sides lose many people, but Charles is left in possession of Saint-Denis. But by taking a stand there, he had, of course, left Paris wide open.
With the collapse of the Franks at Saint-Denis, the way to Paris is clear. The siege of Paris is about to begin.
We're floating in the middle of the Seine. If we were the Vikings, we'd have come down the coast all the way, following the coastline of Europe, down from Scandinavia and into the mouth of the river here. And we know that by the time they got all the way here to the outskirts of Paris, the Vikings had been fighting a number of engagements as they proceeded up the river.
That's right. They had to fight their way past a number of towns and through hostile countryside all the way.
The year is 845 as the Viking fleet masses at the walls of Paris.
The city was defended by enormous Roman walls, none of which, unfortunately, survive today. And that's why we're here in Le Mans, precisely because the walls of this city do survive, and they give us just about the best chance we've got of seeing what Paris's defenses would have looked like. If we think of this as Paris, what we're looking at is the Seine out here, the ships right up against the base of the wall, which we know came down to the water. These really are very impressive fortifications. Very high, very thick, solid, a very daunting obstacle to any Viking force attacking. They have to get up the wall, presumably with scaling ladders or some other device, but certainly ladders. All the while, people are raining all kinds of stuff down on them from the parapet. Archery is a very important part of these sieges, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. And with towers like this, every 50 feet or so, those enabled to shoot across the gaps. So from here, you can really only attack directly downwards. But from the towers, you've got crossfire as well.
If they manage to get up the ladder, which is a difficult enough undertaking, sooner or later they're going to appear there on the edge, and facing them are a number of very angry Franks who want to prevent that. And this is where all the other close-quarter weapons come into play. A very, very bloody affair indeed.
Outnumbered and overwhelmed, the Frankish army is crushed, the city plundered. But it doesn't end there. 40 years later, the Vikings are back on the Seine. And this time, at least one historic record puts Rollo among the leaders.
The wonderful thing about the 885 siege of Paris is we have an unusually good account of it written by a monk called Abbo Cornuus, who lived just outside the city. And he's present, he's there, and he records in detail what happens. So we did take some elements of this fantastic account.
After the disastrous siege of 845, the Franks have built a series of defensive bridges designed to stop the Vikings.
You look at a bridge like this and a modern bridge, it's designed to allow boats to come underneath it easily. That's exactly what these bridges were not designed to do. They'd be much lower, they might even have blockages across to stop anything getting under at all. And if you did come under, you'd come underneath. You don't need trained soldiers to drop rocks onto a wooden boat.
So in 885, the focus of the campaign is on the bridges to stop the Viking fleet from passing Paris and continuing on up the river.
Yes, well, fire would have been an important weapon in siege at that time. Although the walls were stone, most of the buildings inside would have been timber. The bridges would have been largely timber. This time, the city holds fast. It holds strong, despite being massively outnumbered.
At the end, they simply fight themselves to a standstill. And the rather anticlimactic end of the siege is that the Franks simply pay the Vikings to go away. So both sides, in a way, get what they want. The Franks have their city intact. The Vikings have their reward.
But as the drama series shows, not all the Vikings go away. Historic records reveal that Rollo continues raiding for more than 20 years.
When we get to Rollo, get a more sophisticated Viking than the just, I'm going to sack your monastery and I'm going to threaten you until you pay me to go away. He's someone who wants more.
The drama series character of Rollo is one of the most famous Vikings of history. Absolutely a real person. Rollo is his English name. It comes from the French Roland. This is a man who has been on decades of Viking raids.
The
biggest artistic license we took with the TV show Vikings is to make Ragnar and Rollo brothers in the show, because they weren't related in any way and actually lived many decades apart. But they're two fantastic characters in Viking history, and what better way than to blend the stories in one TV show than to make them siblings.
We are brothers. You and I will always be equal.
Rollo could have just been a jealous brother.
My brother.
And I remember saying to Clive early in the process, I said, you'll never guess that in the end you're probably the most successful of them all.
Desperate to stop the Vikings, the Frankish king offers Rollo a deal in the year 911.
You will be offered a vast area of land in the northern part of Francia. The Emperor will also make you a duke, the highest honor he can bestow. You will be very rich and you will be very important.
What must I do in the return?
Neil Price and Gareth Williams have arrived at the august French National Archives to see what records remain of the Frankish king's attempt to buy peace with Rollo.
So, what we have here is one of the very early documentary records of the granting of land to Vikings in France.
Yeah. Yes, it's a charter of the Frankish king Charles the Simple.
It's from 918.
There's Rollo himself, together with his companion Northmen for the defense of the kingdom. And that's really the point of this settlement. It's effectively setting a thief to catch a thief, putting Vikings at the mouth of the Seine to stop other Vikings coming up the river.
That grant of land is made at the mouth of the Seine because that is the point of access ultimately to Paris. If we settle Vikings there, they can stop other Vikings from getting into the river.
1100 years after it was signed, this extraordinary document is the only remaining record of Rollo agreeing to a settlement.
What we're seeing is the essence of Rollo's transformation, actually, from a pagan Viking raider to what he would later become.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Shortly after, the one-time Viking warlord becomes a Christian convert.
He gets land, he gets power, he gets status, and above all, he minimizes the risk. He gets all of these things without fighting anymore.
Rollo would go on to rule a large part of northern France for close to 20 years. Today, that region is known as Normandy, or the land of the Norsemen.
Rollo, c'est vos salut.
J'avoue, salut.
And this is why we've come to Rouen Cathedral. This is the heart of Normandy. It's the place where Rollo was baptized, and here he is, his burial place. We have every reason to believe that his bones really are in here.
It's an incredible moment for me, because I remember coming here when I was about 11 years old on a school trip. And I would have had no idea that, this would have been full circle and I'd be playing this character.
This also marks a different kind of full circle for Rollo. At the end of his life, he's a Christian ruler of a Christian duchy and buried here in this magnificent cathedral.
I never forgive myself if I didn't touch him. Incredible.
The Viking invasions don't end with the death of the mighty Rollo. For the next 150 years, the Vikings carve a path of conquest and plunder across Europe. And their legacy will last much longer. In the next century, Rollo's descendant, William the Conqueror, will become the King of England.
I just am very proud of the fact that this is as authentic as we can make it. It's done in the belief that the Vikings were and are incredibly interesting.